What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Just wanted to remind you guys to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you end up enjoying this video, and if you're enjoying the daily uploads. If we could get to 1,000 likes on all these regular videos, I think that's a pretty good spot to aim for. When you do these things, it really helps the channel to grow and ensure that I can keep making these videos daily for a long time to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in these videos, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts about making these videos is hearing your guys' thoughts about the stories therein. Without further ado, I will let you guys enjoy the next hour or so of true scary stories, and I will see you guys again at the end of the video. I'm from the countryside. In fact, my family home lies just beyond the shadow of a tall mountain. The land the mountain stands on is actually owned by my grandfather. Our family have always been happy to allow villagers to use the land, as long as a small portion of their profits are shared with us. By that, I mean the grounds are free to walk, and the fields are free to work on. The game is free to hunt as well. To me, that doesn't seem like much of a bad deal, due to my family's history of being somewhat more than kind with this arrangement. We have been beset by thieves over the years. Since our family wanted to make sure we continued this community spirit, the older men in my family offered to patrol the mountain ranges at night in search of any wandering thieves. My family would often remind me of areas on the mountain range that would be dangerous at night. In their words, it was for adults only, the adult world, no children allowed. Of course, that didn't stop me and my friends from exploring, though we found out pretty quickly why the adults didn't want us to play in those areas. For one, the wildlife, but more realistically, there was this really deep cave. To us kids, that cave was one of our favorite playgrounds. It felt like it was all ours, and that led to this experience. I was just a kid, obviously, but this experience has lived with me for the rest of my days, and probably will until I die. I was playing in the forbidden area of the mountain range, just like normal. I was in the cave when all of a sudden I had the urge to pee. I decided to head out and do it behind a tree. We were usually nervous about being in places we were explicitly told not to play in, but the possibility of being caught using the restroom out there gave me the willies especially. I kept looking around to make sure the coast was clear, but as I was midstream, I suddenly saw a stranger walking up toward the cave. He was down near the river, approaching quietly. I shot back behind the tree. I didn't even have a chance to pull my pants up all the way. He appeared to be a middle-aged man by the look of it, and I had never seen him before. I knew everyone who was permitted to use this mountain range. It wasn't exactly a big village. My family had been talking about someone who had been stealing our mushrooms. That may sound trivial to you, but those mushrooms were a large part of our source of income, and it was really impacting us. It made sense this stranger could be the thief. Everyone talked about how they'd caught glimpses of him carrying a backpack. This man was clearly on the lookout for something. If this was the thief that my family was so worried about, then I didn't want to be seen by him. I stayed out of sight in the trees and bushes. I felt like such an idiot. This was exactly what my parents had warned me about. I watched the stranger creep around, obviously looking for something. I kept a close eye on him to make sure he didn't spot me or try to approach me. I had no plan if he really did. I was just too scared to take my eyes off him. I watched him for a while, and then I noticed someone approaching the man from behind. I knew who was approaching very well. He was my uncle. He approached the stranger. He was holding a shovel. He stopped the man, and it looked like they were in conversation for a moment. I was too far away to make out anything they were saying, though. My uncle seemed to be admonishing this guy, giving him a real telling off, you know? The stranger, or should I say the thief, took off his backpack at what appeared to be the order of my uncle. He snatched it and opened it, and then I saw him get very angry. Then something happened that I didn't think would ever be a possibility. My uncle smacked the man across the back of the head with the shovel. The thief went limp and fell flat on his face in the dirt. My uncle continued to pound his lifeless body, and then dragged the stranger over to the river once he wasn't moving anymore. I watched as his lifeless body bobbed down the stream. My uncle then walked off in the opposite direction like nothing had happened. That scared the hell out of me. My uncle was the younger of two brothers, the elder being my dad. I recalled so many memories of having fun with my uncle and him making me laugh when I was a kid. He was hilarious, but in that moment he didn't resemble anything like the uncle I loved. He looked so cold and expressionless. It got even worse when he came around to our house for dinner that night. I had to sit opposite of him, knowing exactly what he had done. He was smiling and joking with me as usual, as if nothing had ever happened at all. At one point, he looked me right in the eyes. He and my father spoke about trespassers on the mountain range. And you know what? The thief didn't ever come back. I'm not exactly sure what happened to him, but I can guess based on what I saw. He never went to the police or anything, so I imagine that his tale ended there. I learned a lot about the adult world they had warned me about that day, and their off-limit areas. It was a really scary experience, and I haven't been able to look at my uncle in the same way since. This story takes place during the height of the pandemic in 2020. I had always been a little overweight and lazy, and since there was no one out on the roads, I decided to take up walking. My neighborhood wraps around itself. By the time you made it all the way around, you would have walked an entire mile. The only people I ever saw were this nice couple that walked around the same time I did. We would always stop and have these nice little chats from time to time. I would even look forward to my walks just to talk to these people, but one day they vanished. I would never see them out and about. The grass outside their home became overgrown, and it seemed like parts of their house became damaged from neglect. After a while, curiosity got the best of me. I would knock on their door whenever I would pass by their house, but I would never get an answer. On the day in question, I had been very busy and had missed my daily walk. I decided to take my walk during night instead. I grabbed a flashlight and went on my way. I eventually passed by their house, and I noticed the front door was wide open. Being the curious person I was, I walked down the driveway and called out into it. Hello? Is anyone here?" It was all quiet, but as I stood there, I heard a creak over to my right. I peeked inside with my flashlight, and my light fell upon a tall and rough-looking man just standing there grinning at me. I was startled when I saw him. He lunged toward me and began to chase me. As I mentioned earlier, I was very overweight, so I couldn't run very fast. He would have caught up to me easily if it weren't for a car passing by right at that moment. The man instantly turned around and ran back inside. I managed to get away and call the police. When they arrived, they found the man in the same spot he'd been in when I first saw him. It wouldn't be until a while later before all the details truly came out. The man who chased me that night confessed to brutally murdering the kind couple who lived at that home and burying their bodies in the backyard. He also admitted to torturing them before ending their lives. The night I walked into that house, he was in the middle of making sure the bodies were not uncovered by some heavy rain. The house was bulldozed after they dug up the bodies, and the couple were given a proper burial. The scumbag tried to plead insanity, but the court ruled that out, giving him 2 life sentences without parole. I sometimes still walk past where that couple once lived, and every time I do, I think about how those 2 sweet, innocent people were taken out of this world by a monster. My parents own a small shop in our town. It's nothing special really, just selling regular groceries and food from local businesses. They'd been running it for over 20 years, and my dad took it very seriously. He kept the store open until 12 o'clock every night, sometimes even staying later. When I turned 16, I started helping out there a few hours a week, and when I turned 18, I started working full-time while doing online college courses. This night was my dad's day off. My mom was having some health issues at the time, so it was just me closing the store. It usually stays not very busy for the last few hours of the night, and there was never too much to stock either. Around 9 o'clock, almost no customers were coming in anymore. I think only 1 or 2 people came in. I grabbed a sandwich from the fridge and took a quick lunch break. Of course, right as I did that, someone walked in. I made my way back to the front desk and put my sandwich aside, waiting for the customer to finish shopping. First, I pulled my phone out though. After a couple of minutes, I looked up to see how this customer was doing, but I didn't see him. I scanned the room again and didn't see anyone anywhere. I was thinking they were maybe in some off angle I couldn't see. I waited a few more minutes, but they still never came into sight. In fact, I didn't even hear anyone walking around. Something was off here. I walked around the counter and started looking through all the aisles. It didn't take me long to find them. In the second aisle, a man was crouched down at the very end, staring absent-mindedly at the floor and not moving or making a single sound. The man immediately looked up at me and stood up, then affixed his gaze to me this time. All I could focus on were his eyes. They were wide and full, in a kind of unsettling way. After a couple of seconds of observing me, he quickly walked away and out of the store, never having spoken a single word. Once I saw him leave, my first reaction was to check where he had been crouching and see if there was any reason to be there. Of course, there wasn't. That meant the whole time he was just crouching in the aisle, staring at the floor. It kind of freaked me out because of how odd it was. I went up to the front door and checked that he'd fully left the area. Obviously, it was very dark out, but I didn't see the man anywhere around. I went back to the counter and stayed a little more alert from then on. 3 hours passed by, and not a single customer had come in. It was now time to close up. After so much time passing, I wasn't even thinking about that man anymore. I was just ready to go home. I walked up to the front and locked up the door, then grabbed my bag and started walking toward the back door to leave. That was when an extremely loud bang screeched throughout the store. I stopped in place, knowing it had come from somewhere in the back. It was so loud I had no idea what it could have been. Now worried, I slowly walked to the corner and looked down the back hallway. At the far end, dust was scattering through the air, and the metal back door was loosely open. Standing right in the hallway was that same man from earlier. He was staring at me with the same wide-open eyes. I didn't know what to say or do. It was like I was just frozen in that moment. Despite his clear determination to break in, the man didn't look angry or anything. He had no emotions at all. I took a few steps back and then ran for the front, leaving the store and running to the other side of the street. I called 911 first, then called my dad too. He rushed over to make sure I was okay. The man at the store was gone when the police got there, but he left behind a sledgehammer sitting on the pavement behind the door. At first sight, nothing looked to be missing or stolen, so the man's intentions were anyone's best guess. It was clear he was unstable, though, which means he could have been planning anything. Thankfully for me, I didn't have to find out what that was. I will keep this as short as possible, but I want to share a weird experience of mine. If nothing comes of this, that's fine, but I'm just wondering if anyone else out there has a different perspective to my own. It happened when I used to work in a convenience store. I used to work a late-night shift. In fact, I used to know the regulars by a first-name basis. One of those regulars is who this story is about. I remember one night, I suddenly got slipped a piece of paper by one of these regulars. In case it matters, I'm a guy, and this regular was a woman. On the piece of paper I was handed, it contained her contact information. Our store had a strict no-contact rule, though, so I didn't do anything with her number. I just kinda ignored it. I was flattered overall, but found it somewhat inappropriate. She was older by quite a bit, and very nice, but I didn't feel great about getting her private information. That didn't stop her from coming to our store, though. She was still a regular. Over a period of a couple of weeks, though, I started to notice some changes in her behavior. I guess it was probably down to the fact that I never contacted her. She came to the store more often than usual, and seemed to spend more and more time browsing. It got to the point where I would see her when I clocked in, and she would stay there until I finished my shift and follow me out. At this point, I would just like to point out once again that I was on the night shift, so this woman would turn up when it was dark and effectively leave once it was bright out again. She would never buy anything either. She would just stand there glaring at me. If I looked her way or met her gaze at all, she would immediately look away, then look back when she thought I was looking in a different direction. It felt like she was watching me. She was watching me, as if she was there to keep an eye on me. I hated the way she would wander around the store not buying anything, peeking out from behind aisles. I hated feeling her eyes on me at all times. I managed to push the whole customer is always right message, but I had just about as much as I could stand of that woman and the way she loitered around me, following me everywhere. I was uncomfortable. I asked the manager to please ban her from the store. Thankfully, he agreed. I watched the ban happen live. I was there in the store. Surprisingly, she took it better than I imagined. She just stood there and listened and remained calm, seemingly. When the manager was done with his speech, she left without saying a word. I thought I had just managed to handle that difficult situation, but little did I know I hadn't even started. On my next night shift, true to her word, she did not enter the store. Instead, she turned up outside and stared at me through the windows. She couldn't enter the premises, but I could feel her eyes on me at all times. Even though she was not physically allowed to enter, it felt as if she had never left at all. I might be sounding a bit dramatic, but honestly, if you've never been in a situation like that, it's incredibly distracting and very scary to have someone stare at you for your entire night shift, especially because it was quite cold out and the windows of the store were a bit fogged up. I knew she could see me from outside, but I couldn't really see her at all. I could feel her eyes on me. It was at that point I realized that this was not just a crush or something. This was someone I needed to be wary of. That feeling of wariness slowly turned into fear. I was scared whenever I saw her. I used to have to walk home from the night shift, and I was so nervous she would follow me home and try to do something to me. That fear soon turned into reality. She would approach me from out of the darkness and try to strike up a conversation with me, pretending she had just run into me out of the blue. She would say it was such a coincidence that we were walking the same way home. I used to move around in circles until she gave up on following me, just so she wouldn't find out where I lived. In the meantime, I was proactive. I was trying to get transferred to work at a different store. I finally got to switch to a different one. It was in the same chain of convenience store I worked for, but was a lot farther away. I didn't really mind that much though, as long as I could get away from her. It might be a little anticlimactic, but that's kind of it. As far as I can tell, I did not run into her again, and nothing else really came of it. I know a lot of you must be thinking that I should have called the police or done something else, but the rules in Japan are very blurry when it comes to the topic of stalking. The cops aren't really interested until something happens. I probably should have spotted the signs earlier, but at least I'll know for next time. I really hope there won't be a next time though. This was a really scary experience. At this new store, I was constantly looking out the windows, expecting to see her. It really made those longer walks home a lot more scary too. I constantly had the thought that she could pop out from anywhere. This is a true story that involves my firstborn son. He was in 2nd grade at the time, and we were living in Tacoma, Washington. It's been 27 years since this occurred, but it still haunts me to this day. A little backstory to put these events into perspective. It was January of 1995. My son, up to this point, had been walking to and from his bus stop, which was a block and a half away from our home, located at the bottom of a steep hill. He would have to walk down in the mornings and up in the afternoons. There was an elderly man from Korea who lived across the street from us. He'd been brutally murdered, which was an unrelated incident to this. Needless to say, though, the tensions were very high in our neighborhood around this time. We lived in a small complex with 4 houses, each one having their own fenced-in yard. There was an entry gate that enclosed everything. My son used to take a shortcut through an alleyway that ran behind the houses to get to his bus stop. He had done it so many times before that it became completely normal, and there wasn't a worry in the world as to our son's safety. That is, until the day in question. That day started out just like any other. I woke up at around 6 o'clock to get the kids ready for school. Our second was the first one to leave. He was in special ed and had to be bused across the city. Then our eldest son left the house. I watched him as he walked through the complex, then out the gate, and disappeared down the alleyway. Fast forward to that afternoon. I knew my eldest son would be coming home soon. I was busy in the home tending to chores when I heard a frantic knocking at my door. I opened it and saw through the screen door that it was my next-door neighbor. She had a terrified look on her face. "Hey, what's wrong?" I asked her. She then told me she'd seen someone trying to lure my son into their car. I immediately screamed for my husband, and we both ran out of the house. To our horror, there was someone in a white sedan reaching through the driver's side window of the vehicle and pulling my son in by his shirt. If you aren't a parent, you can't imagine how terrifying this was to witness. I went ballistic, while my husband ran towards the car, screaming to get the fuck off our son. He managed to pull away from the driver with our distraction and quickly backed against the perimeter fence. I saw that every time he went to move, the vehicle kept moving to prevent him from escaping. At this point, all the neighbors that lived across the alley, who were friends with my husband, heard the commotion. They looked over their fence, and one sprinted in front of the sedan. The other swept our son into his arms and quickly brought him over to us. The assailant, now unable to escape, sat in his car, stoned silent and not moving at all. I remember staring into his soulless eyes. I had never seen such emptiness in my life. It sent shivers down my backside, like I was looking into the eyes of the devil himself. The driver actually sat there long enough that we were able to get a complete physical description of him, the vehicle, and his license plate information. My next-door neighbor called the police, but after a while he forced his way through with the car and was able to escape. It still freaks me out to think about what would have happened to our son if my next-door neighbor hadn't seen what she saw that day. We might have never seen our son again. Another thing that really upsets me is that right before the man took off, he pulled out one of those old Polaroid cameras and took a few pictures of my son. That really got under my skin. When a police officer finally came, he looked like he was fresh out of high school. I remember him eyeing me skeptically and saying I was just being a hysterical mom. Like, what the fuck? Is that what you tell someone who just saw their son almost get taken? My advice to all police is to not send a rookie to investigate a child abduction case, and don't hire fucking morons. The incident scarred me for life, and for the longest time I wouldn't let our son out of my sight. I made him hold my hand everywhere we went, and I went to extremes to protect my other children as well. If you think that nothing bad can ever happen to you, please think again and take caution. To end things on a more happy note, my son is now 35, happily married, and is a successful auto mechanic with his own shop now. This story took place in July of 2020 in South Australia. My friends and I were all around 14 to 15 at the time. There were 7 of us in total. It was a Saturday night, and my friends and I were planning on staying the night at our friend Sean's house. The night started out relatively normal. We all just walked around the block and caused a bit of a ruckus, like teenagers tend to do. That was until around 11 p.m. We decided to walk to the boat ramp, which was down the street from Sean's house. We wanted to go chill out by the ocean. To give some perspective, Sean's house sat almost at the end of a long street, and at the opposite end was a small turnoff that goes downhill toward the boat ramp. Houses lined one side of the path, and the other side was nothing but trees and bushes. The boat ramp itself was also surrounded by thick shrubs. Eventually, we did make it to the boat ramp. As we looked down the hill to where we wanted to go, we saw 2 cars parked near the water, maybe 100 yards away from us or so. Now, at this point, we had no reason to be worried. Could have just been a couple of folks enjoying a late-night drive for all we know. As teen boys, we wanted to make the situation as dramatic as possible, though, so instead of proceeding to the boat ramp, we began walking across the parking lot toward the surrounding forest. This was in full view of the parked cars, mind you. Now, this is where I made a very stupid decision. Our group split up into pairs, and I was at the very back with Josh. Most of the group had already made their way into the forest. I then mentioned for Josh to stop walking. "Hold up, man, check this out," I said. I then called out to those vehicles. "Hey fuckers, we know what you're doing!" A second later, someone from the car shouted back at us, saying they were going to cut us. We heard both cars start up, and soon they were coming right for us. My heart dropped. We began sprinting in the bushes, and probably ran for about 200 yards before stopping to catch our breath. After another 10 minutes, we concluded we were probably no longer being chased. They wouldn't have been able to see us from the road anyway. Just to be safe, though, instead of taking the path back to the road, we continued through the trees. We walked for maybe another 10 minutes before making it back to the road. We then headed back towards Sean's house. We soon changed our minds, though, and decided to walk down to the small beach across the street. Since the boat ramp hadn't worked out too well. Once we were there, we just chilled out for a while. From where we were positioned on the beach, we could see the boat ramp parking lot, and the cars that were there before were now back in place. I would like to reinforce that we were all extremely stupid and irresponsible, so what we decided to do next was just ill-advised to say the least. We walked back up the road to the boat ramp. We were curious about what they were doing. Was this a drug deal? Something extreme like dumping a body into the ocean? I know it sounds ridiculous, but we were all bored and full of adrenaline. We settled that it was possibly a drug deal going down, and we thought it would be funny to yell at them again. Yeah, I know it's stupid, but we didn't really consider the danger we could have all been in. It was decided that Josh would be the one to yell at them. Once we were all ready, Josh ran into the middle of the turnoff and yelled at them, "Hey, you guys doing drugs down there?" We all stood still for a few seconds, anticipating the reaction. I thought they might not do anything at first, but I was wrong. The cars pulled out of their parking spots and turned around until they were facing us. We were like deer caught in the headlights. Not a word was spoken, but we all broke into a full-on sprint as the cars began speeding towards us. A few of us were all running a lot faster than the others, so we were all at varying distances from the road. Looking back, I was horrified to see that the cars were still speeding right for us. I looked to my right and spotted a large bush. Two of my friends dove in front of me. Josh also dove into another bush. I followed. We crouched down behind these bushes and just watched the car slowly pass by. My heart was in my throat the entire time. Once it was out of sight, we waited for another 5 minutes before we felt safe enough to make a run back to Sean's house. We were all pretty shaken up at that point, but there wasn't really anything we could do about it. Technically, they hadn't really done anything that we knew of looking back on it. I know that we were extremely stupid and put ourselves into a dangerous situation, but it still unsettles me nonetheless. What would have happened if they'd actually caught one of us? It really does make me wonder, why would they have any reason to chase a bunch of kids in the first place? This happened when I was in high school. I used to have to go to these after-school classes that my mom planned. At the time, I really hated it, but now I get why she made me do it, now that I'm older. Sometimes, on the way home from cram school, I would be asked to pick up a couple of items from the convenience store. You know, just everyday things, really. I ended up going in there every now and then, and out of habit, I would browse the magazines and manga and look around, trying to break up the evening a little. I mean, I wasn't exactly in a rush to head home and get started on my homework, you know. I was heading down the street as usual when I heard a thunder of footsteps coming down the street behind me. I thought to myself, oh, I must have forgotten the change at the register or something. As a side note, that happens a lot in Japan. If you forget your change or your tip or something, you'll likely be chased down by the staff to give you your money back. Then I realized something though. I hadn't actually bought anything at all. I was just looking around. My next thought was, oh gosh, do they suspect me of stealing something? I hadn't done anything wrong, so I assumed that the clerk was running down the road for a different reason. But I wasn't really sure what to make of what happened next. The clerk said she needed to speak to me right now. She was a woman and grabbed me, then ushered me back to the store, pleading and apologizing the whole time. I didn't really know what was going on. I was a high school kid, so I just thought I'd better do what this adult said. I really didn't want to be in trouble. She took me through the back room of the convenience store, some kind of staff room. She kept saying sorry over and over again. Then she said this, "I saw something. I just couldn't live with myself if I let you go without telling you." I was sat down in the staff room, and I had little choice but to listen to what she had to say. I can't remember everything, so I'll just give you some bullet points of what she said. She said that she had seen something on one of the security monitors. Said she saw a ghostly apparition appear behind me or something. It appeared to beckon me through the door and out of the store. She saw the ghost or whatever start violently beckoning when I was walking out the door. I guess to her it looked like whatever this was dragging me outside, and she was scared that something terrible was going to happen to me. I really had no idea how exactly I should take this news. Obviously, my immediate thoughts were, can I go home now? I really just want to go home. You know, stuff like that. I just nodded along and tried to fake a serious look of contemplation. I guess I'm not that great of an actor though, because the clerk grabbed onto my arm quite tight. She must have seen the doubt on my face. She kept on yelling at me to listen to her, to believe her. I was starting to get scared, not of whatever ghost she was trying to warn me about, but scared of her. Her eyes grew wide, and they looked completely crazed. She wouldn't let me go. She was grabbing me so hard that her nails were digging into my skin, and I didn't know what to do. On top of all of this, she was really attractive, so I was mega confused as an adolescent boy. I ended up doing my best to just agree with her. I said that I believed her and her version of events. She had this really scary intensity about her, and it made me feel like if I denied her even one more time, something bad was going to happen to me. I wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. I didn't really know what to make of all that once she finally let me go. I guess that if something really was beckoning me or trying to lure me, then obviously it didn't work. I've never experienced any form of paranormal activity, so I don't really believe in that sort of thing. The thing that really scared me about that day was how crazy the clerk acted. I mean, to chase down a high school kid down the street and try to convince them a ghost was following them and not let them go? What a very scary and unique experience. I'm a warehouse worker for a small business in my city. I'd been in and out of jobs for quite a while, so this wasn't really a career or anything. I just did what I had to do every night, and that was it. Specifically, I had to unload pallets of shipments that came in, and put everything in their designated places in the warehouse. Super simple job. Most of the time, I popped some earbuds in and listened to music while I did it. With the warehouse not being too big, very rarely would there be another person working overnight with me. That would really only be on the holidays. This night was just a regular night, though. I came in, counted up the stock, put my headphones in, and started unloading the boxes from the shipments. I started at 10 p.m. It was probably sometime between 12 and 1 when a loud knock echoed through the building. I took my headphones out and listened in, but I didn't hear it anymore. The building was old and would creak and groan throughout the nights, especially when it was windy outside. What I'd heard wasn't that, though. I'd very clearly heard someone knocking. I walked down to the back of the building, looked around, and then went to the front as well. I didn't see anything inside. I opened up the front door and looked outside. The parking lot was empty, and the night was completely still and quiet. I shut and locked the door once more, then went back to working, thinking I may have just misheard things. Being more cautious now, though, I left my headphones out for a bit. 20-ish minutes went by before I heard something again. This wasn't a knock, though. It was more of a single thump coming from somewhere near the front. I hurried down the hallway and up to the front portion of the warehouse. Nothing. There were no signs of anything wrong, nor was there anyone at the door. I knew what I heard this time, though, which is why I started to get kind of nervous. I stood in the middle of the room for a moment and just looked around silently, listening and looking for anything to be the cause of these noises. Standing there, I got a bad gut feeling. Something wasn't good about this. I walked up to the front door and leaned on it to look out at the parking lot again. As I put my weight on the door, though, it swung open with ease. I stumbled forward, not expecting it. It was almost as if the door hadn't been locked or latched at all. Thing is, I had double-checked and locked it not even a half hour ago. I looked at the door and saw the latch lying broken on the ground in front of me. My stomach tightened, and I felt my adrenaline suddenly spike. Not even seconds later, I heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing from the dim hallway behind me. I quickly fled through the door and into the parking lot, still dazed and unsure. Once I got a good distance from the door, I turned around. Barely visible through the glass on the door was the shape of a figure walking up to the other side. They moved around for a moment, definitely looking at me. Then they walked away. I called the police as soon as I could and waited in the parking lot for them to arrive. I never saw any more movement in the building. When they arrived, they found that whoever this was had already left through the back door. Seems like they couldn't really figure out anything else to help solve the case. A few things did show up missing, but nothing substantial. Honestly, it was probably more from a wrong stock count more than anything. Regardless of if anything had been stolen, though, to break the latch like that, he must have had some kind of tool or weapon on him, which only makes the whole thing more scary. They'd also moved the door back to look like it was closed, knowing it would keep me from figuring out what was going on. Maybe if I hadn't noticed the door was broken, I would have come face to face with whoever that man was, and I have no way of knowing how that would have turned out. Although unlikely, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was coming after me for some reason. Because of that, I've since left that job and moved on, hoping I don't run into whoever that was again. About a month ago, my friends and I got some tickets to a professional hockey game in Minneapolis. The game was about a 5-hour drive from where we lived, so we decided to make a weekend trip out of it. On that Friday afternoon, I was picked up by my friend Kevin. We then drove to pick up my other friend Dan and hit the road. We weren't heading for a motel, but instead to the house of our mutual friend Jack. Jack lived in North Minneapolis, and he offered to let us stay with him for the weekend. We had all grown up together and were really good friends with each other. He also had a ticket to the hockey game as well, so things were really lining up for us. We arrived at Jack's house early in the morning, and Kevin parked the car out front. He then texted Jack to let him know we were there. We all got out and walked over to the trunk to grab our bags. It was at about this time that we suddenly heard tires screeching. We turned to look at the intersection directly behind us. A green compact car had apparently cut off a dark-colored SUV. Both vehicles came to a stop, and the two male drivers rolled down their windows and began screaming at each other. Not wanting to get involved, I quickly grabbed my things and walked up the path towards Jack's house, with Dan close behind me. Jack lived in a sort of retrofitted duplex where he rented out the ground floor, and someone else lived on the second. Jack had moved to the city fairly recently, and we had never visited him until now. When we entered the walk-in porch, Dan and I weren't sure which door was his. As we stood there, I pulled out my phone to call him and asked him to let us in. Meanwhile, Kevin was still in the back of his car, rearranging some bags and trying to fix a panel that had popped off during the drive. We could hear the two drivers still yelling at each other, and at this point they had both exited their vehicles, it seemed. I didn't have a great view of the situation from the porch, but I could clearly hear them yelling. To make matters worse, Jack's house was right on the corner, so we were only 20 yards away from where this was all going down. It was way too close for comfort. All of a sudden, we heard a loud pop. Dan and I froze. I saw Kevin standing up from the back of his car and looking around. I immediately thought it may have been a gunshot, but I wasn't 100% sure. I turned to Dan, and from the look on his face, I saw he also thought that as well. "Oh shit, let's get the hell inside now," Dan said to me. I unfroze and called Jack, who said he was on his way to open the door. We heard the two cars peel off. Kevin joined us on the porch, and we all came to the conclusion that there had indeed been gunfire. One of the two drivers must have fired it during their confrontation. We didn't know who fired the shot or in which direction the bullet went. Jack let us into the house, commenting that he'd heard the shot go off too, and swearing that nothing like that had ever happened since he moved in. We talked about it for a bit, but thankfully no one had been hurt, it seemed. The drivers were gone now, so we shook it off. Aside from that, we had a great weekend of eating, exploring, and getting drunk at a nail-biter of a hockey game. It was loads of fun, and Jack offered to drive us everywhere, since he knew the area well. When we were ready to head home that Sunday afternoon, we piled back into Kevin's car, and that's when we realized exactly where the bullet had gone. There was a clean bullet hole going through his dashboard and right through the back. It had missed Kevin by only centimeters. I have no idea how he didn't notice that before. There were shards of glass and scattered bits of plastic all across inside. Based on the bullet's trajectory, if it had just been a bit over, he would have been struck right in the head or neck. Once the shock of our discovery wore off, we called the police to get a report for insurance purposes. An officer showed up, and Kevin showed her the bullet hole. At first, she was quite confused. I think for a second she even suspected we had been messing around and fired a gun at the vehicle ourselves. When Kevin told her all the details, though, I saw the officer's jaw drop. Unfortunately, none of us could provide her with any useful information, like a detailed description of the shooter or a license plate number. Our next issue was finding out how the heck we were going to drive 5 hours with a bullet hole through the car and a busted-up windshield as well. Thankfully, a patch-up job of sealer and duct tape from the local hardware store seemed to do the trick well enough. On the drive home, we had a very solemn conversation where we spent a few hours of hard thinking about the fragility of human life. Even now, I'm not sure if I've fully processed just how close Kevin came to dying. I can't imagine how he feels about it. As for the guy who thought it was a good idea to fire a gun in the middle of a highly populated neighborhood, I hope he either gets his life in order or ends up in jail soon. When I was in my 3rd year of junior high school, we had some entrance exams coming up at school, and my parents expected me to get the best grades possible. I was enrolled into a cram school. A cram school is basically just school after school. You go to a specific class to focus on specific topics. It's pretty dull, honestly, and it makes the day feel super long. After school finishes, I make my way to CR school. We lived in a really rural area, so the cram schools weren't exactly close by. In order to get there, I had to go through this long, dark tunnel that was pretty creepy even in summer. I lived in an elevated area a little ways up in the mountains, so tunnels were fairly common. My parents said that when they were my age, they got themselves to their lessons and back and expected me to do the same. From a young age, I was pretty active. Because of this, my friends at school used to tease me a lot and said the tunnel was an active spot for ghosts. Like I said, the tunnel was creepy, but it wasn't as if I was scared of anything paranormal. I really didn't believe in ghosts at all. That all changed on the day this experience took place, though. That day, I headed to my cram school lesson as normal. After my regular classes, I entered the tunnel. It was really long and always dark in there, even during the day. That day, I felt a chill at my back, despite there being no breeze at all. I thought I might have been catching a cold or something, so I didn't pay it much mind. I just tried to hurry to get myself a little warmer. Something caught my eye, though. It was dark in the tunnel, sure, but it wasn't exactly pitch black. That's how I noticed something strange lying on the floor up ahead. 2 objects that were bright red. They were a pair of shoes, high-heel ones it seemed. I was a little girl at the time growing into a teen, so I was instantly drawn to them. I would have stopped and looked at them, maybe even picked them up if I had the time. But volleyball practice had overrun time at school, making me late for my cram school lessons. While I was at cram school, though, I couldn't focus really. I couldn't get those mysterious shoes out of my head. I mean, why were they there? Did someone walk into the tunnel wearing them and then just leave them behind for some reason? I didn't walk back through the tunnel because my mother came to pick me up. That was fine. I didn't like the idea of walking home through that tunnel in the dark anyway. The following day was a Saturday. I was out playing with a friend, and I asked her if she wanted to come with me to the tunnel to see if those shoes were still there. She wouldn't go, though. She was too scared to go, even though it was a really bright day. I decided to go by myself, but I didn't notice the shoes. I didn't exactly look hard, though, because once again, I was running late for something. Are you noticing a theme with my sense of timekeeping? I guess the owner of those shoes must have come back and picked them up, or someone else could have swiped them. It was a bit strange and a bit of a bummer as well. I made a note to double check on Monday on my way to lessons. Monday rolled around, and after school I was approaching the tunnel once again. Just before the tunnel there was a bend in the road. There was a guardrail hugging the border of the road, and just there I saw something go over the edge. It appeared to be something big. It was so weird. It was like a shadow had just fallen off the edge. Like I said, we lived in the mountains. If something goes off the edge, then it's really bad news. Definitely fatal. It's a long way down to the jagged rocks below. Not really understanding what I'd just seen, and potentially being too young to process it, I ran into the tunnel. I wanted to get to the adults at my lesson to tell them about what I'd seen. As I was rushing through, something caught my eye. There were two red objects neatly slapped side by side on the ground ahead. The red shoes were back. I couldn't help but gasp. I stood there looking at them, and then looked up a little ways. I saw something which made me feel as if my little heart stopped. There was a woman standing there in the tunnel. This woman, though, looked quite strange. I can't really explain it other than saying it looked like she was a memory or something. Like she was there, but she wasn't really there. She looked to be about 40 years old. She stood there glaring at me and had the strangest expression on her face. She looked so lonely and desolate. I was so shocked and scared by what I'd seen that I couldn't even scream. I just ran right out of the tunnel. I looked behind me once, and the woman didn't appear to be following me. She just stood there with sunken eyes and a hunched and defeated posture. I ran into a convenience store. I must have been crying and sobbing because I caused such a fuss when I got there that they called my parents right after I gave them my number, and I didn't go to cram school that day. I've never been so terrified in all my life. I never walked through that tunnel again to my lessons. I think when I was around 18 or 19, my mom told me there had been more than a few individuals who had chosen to end things at that bend in the road. I'm not sure, maybe because it's so secluded there, and the tunnel provides a great place to contemplate things. I'm guessing that's why those shoes were there. I wonder if anyone else has had a similar experience to mine. I mean, I hope they haven't because it was horrible. But at the same time, I do wonder. I used to go camping all the time with some of my buddies from college, but once we graduated, we could never really find time anymore. Everyone's schedules were so different. Because of that, I ended up going out on my own. There was a camping ground that we used to go to quite a lot, so I played it safe and went to that same place. It was somewhat far out and not the easiest to get to, but that's why I liked it. Nobody would ever be there because there were a lot of easier options nearby to camp at. Knowing the route, I got there no problem and set up all my stuff. Not long after, though, a man showed up. He looked just like any other hiker, but he only had a small backpack on him, definitely no tent or camping gear. The only thing that had me questioning why he was here was that this wasn't exactly a very scenic spot, or anything like that. It was a nice place to camp at because it was an open area with a lot of trees around, but if you're not camping, there would be no reason to hike all the way out here. I didn't think all that much about it at the time, though. The man seemed normal enough. Maybe he just wanted a quiet space to relax for a while. I stayed by my tent, and the man stayed on the other side of the campgrounds. Around 6 o'clock, I walked away from my tent to cook my food. It was around this time that I saw the man finally leave. I thought it was a little late to be walking back because it was going to be completely dark in less than an hour. The hike was probably 3 hours. Other than that, I was really just happy to be alone now. I boiled some water with my mini stove and made one of my freeze-dried meals. I went back near my tent and sat down. The sun was just about gone, so I brought out a small lantern and hung it on the side of the tent. I stayed outside and took in the atmosphere. It suddenly really hit me that I was all alone out there. Usually, this is where we'd all gather around and talk by the campfire, but by myself, I didn't really have much to do. After a while, I turned off the lantern and went inside my tent, laying down and turning in for the night. Sometime in the middle of the night, though, I woke up to the sound of footsteps nearby. When I opened my eyes, it was pitch black out, and I had no idea how long I'd been asleep for. The footsteps came closer and closer until they stopped on the other end of the campground. After a few seconds, I felt around for my lantern and turned it on. I unzipped the tent and looked out. 20 or so feet away, there was the shape of a man standing right where I'd seen the guy from earlier. From what I could make out, it was likely the same person. They were just standing there, not doing anything. It was far enough into the night that this was immediately disturbing, no matter the context. Having turned on my lantern, this guy definitely noticed my presence. "Hey, you okay?" I called out to him. I waited for a couple of seconds, but he didn't show any sign of acknowledging me. I couldn't even tell which direction he was facing. He was either facing at me or directly away from me. I didn't even know which way would be more disturbing. I reached for my pocket knife from my backpack and then did the only thing I could do, which was stay sitting there and wait. The most increasingly uneasy 15 minutes of my life passed by as I watched the man continue standing there and not move at all. He suddenly turned and walked off in the same direction he had gone before. I could see from the way his figure moved when he turned that he had been facing me the whole time. He had just been there staring at me. I felt chills run through me as the man's footsteps got quieter and quieter, fading out into the distance. I didn't know what to do other than stay up in case the man came back. As far as I know, he never did. I left in the morning and got back safely, but since then I haven't been out camping. I don't know what that man was doing, but there's no world in which that wasn't extremely disturbing. Maybe I scared him off by waking up and watching him to make sure he didn't do anything. But that just terrifies me more to think about what if I hadn't woken up that night. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.